Hi everyone. I've been asked to talk a little bit about a method that we've been using at Oxford University Hospital that I also kind of set up and implemented at Clatterbridge as well. So it's kind of been used at two different trusts now. And it's a method for trying to increase the speed of first year rotation specifically, whilst kind of trying to learn from what trainers and trainees want and trying to maintain the quality of those rotations whilst also making them a little bit quicker. So just a little bit of background. I am in the medical physics specialism, specifically radiotherapy. Within that, there's 4 different specialisms that trainees can choose. There's radiotherapy, nuclear medicine, radiation safety and diagnostic imaging, and non-ionizing radiation. So I think the important thing to note here is that a lot of trainees will enter medical physics as undefined trainees, and they will rotate through all 4 of these areas. And at the end of the year, they have to pick which specialism they'd like to go into for their second and third years. And that is what they will then work in going forward in their career. So it's really important that at the end of these rotations, they've got a really good understanding of what a clinical scientist does in each area. So that was made a little bit harder by the fact that with the new curriculum, these rotations were drastically shorter. So we went from like a 12 to really 18-week rotation to a 4 to 8 week rotation. We've got very different practical aims with the new curriculum. So before, a trainee was very involved in what they were doing. They were expected to actually measure, actually generate, actually perform the competencies. With the new training activities, as we're all very aware now, they're a little bit more light touch. They're expected to observe, reflect, shadow, and those sort of passive verbs rather than leading verbs. And we've got a different level of knowledge required. So for the old competencies, I think we'd expect a very technical report that shows a very deep understanding of a specific task. Whereas now it's the step back awareness of, okay, I understand why this is important and how it fits into the wider pathway or departmental needs, but I don't necessarily know exactly how to do it. So when we were thinking about these changes and how we were going to approach the new curriculum, we also did loads of audits that I haven't got time to include all of them and questionnaires, but I thought the thing that was probably the most interesting to include is we asked the trainees what they thought were most valuable learning experiences, because we knew we wanted to implement that as much as possible. And probably unsurprisingly to most people here, they said they really like to do practical things. They really like to watch things if they've got the opportunity to talk to a specialist member of staff about it. Conversely, when we asked them what the least valuable learning experiences were, top of the list was just watching something with no active discussion. So they don't really know why they're watching it. They don't really know what they should be getting out of it. Reading textbooks without any sort of interactive component, or receiving presentations, again, without any interactive component. And there was an open text box for these questions as well. And trainees kept going back to, I don't like being passive in my training. I want to be active. So if I am listening to something or reading something, I want the opportunity still to talk to someone about it and be asked questions on it. So after that, why have we gone backwards? Sorry. We knew whatever we came up with needed to obviously satisfy the criteria from the national school, be quicker and easier to complete, reduce the training burden on staff. Staff were finding it quite challenging to find time to train, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, and to mark these long written competency submissions were taking quite a while too. We wanted to reduce the amount of time that trainees spent writing. I haven't included the graphs here, but we audited trainees, and I think like the mean time trainees said they were spending writing was about 70–80%, which we were kind of shocked by, because we didn't really want trainees to spend that much time writing. We wanted them to spend time doing and seeing as well. We wanted to give time for valuable feedback and discussions, because that's something trainees said they really wanted. Needed to be very reflective in style. allow for multi-time point reflections as per the national school criteria, and guide trainees and trainers to the right level of understanding, to move away from that old curriculum style of very specific and technical to reflective and awareness, and maintain a mixture of assessment styles, so not just these long report style things. So then we looked at the training activities that were in first year, and this is an example of the radiotherapy ones. And when we were thinking about the activities that we'd usually ask a trainee to do while on rotation and started trying to match those up to the training activities, we realised that there was actually loads of crossover. So, for example, these tasks all fit into shadowing a physicist, but then they also fit into other training activities as well. And then when we mapped this out, it was actually like quite a really complicated matrix. And one of the other things we were thinking about is timings of when the learning happens, when the feedback happens, and we wanted to make sure that that wasn't really spread out as well. So, for example, with that training matrix, if they waited until right at the end of their rotation until they'd seen everything to be able to complete their shadow of physicist training activity, we were worried that like the learning and reflection would happen over a really long period of time, and it wouldn't really be evident if a trainee had misunderstood something along the way. So for example, with the old style, the trainee might see a practical activity and it might take them weeks to write a report submission. It then might take the assessor weeks to give feedback on it. And then it might take the trainee another couple of weeks to resubmit. And then we think about where the learning happens and where we'd notice if the trainee didn't understand. That could even be like over a month after the initial thing that they'd seen. Which we wanted to change with whatever we implemented with the new curriculum. So what we proposed is the trainee sees the practical activity, and then ideally during, or if not very soon after, the trainee has a structured discussion. And then within hours, ideally the same day, the trainee will write a reflection on that activity in their reflective log on one file. And now I think it's a lot more evident where what the trainee has reflected on during that process, if they haven't understood anything, if they've got questions. It happens a lot sooner in the process. So what do they actually submit for their training activity? So they will see all these things in the department that we think feed into a particular training activity. They'll reflect and have this structured discussion with a member of staff, and they'll put that in their reflective log. And when they've accumulated all the necessary things for a particular training activity, they'll book a training activity assessment with an assessor. And we try and keep assessors the same for each training activity to maintain a level of consistency and also efficiency, because then that assessor gets kind of familiar with what they expect for that assessment across trainees in different years. The feedback for that assessment is then uploaded to one file and the training activity is signed off. So we get our multi-point reflections because they're reflecting at the time of doing the things, and then they're also reflecting during their assessment. It's also multi-point reflection actually, because they actually reflect on all the necessary things for each training activity and all the sort of practical things that they're doing whilst on rotation. So for example, every practical that our trainees do, there's a question on, what's the role of the physicist in this particular scenario. So they're reflecting the whole rotation almost on the shadow of physicist training activity. How do we assess? So we've reduced the number of written submissions to 1 to 3 out of the 10 for the rotation. And we say this doesn't have to be a report. This can also be things like a poster or a flowchart. They do 1 to 3 presentations. And I think this is the most different. The remaining are verbal assessments, and these are like Viva style Q&A discussions with an assessor. And all of the assessments that we do have a marking criteria that have set questions, and the trainees are awarded written feedback for each question, and they get a pass-fail for each point. So what does that mean in practice in terms of reflection? It means that we don't read every single reflection that the trainee does, because they might do 30 maybe practical activities or upwards of while on rotation. That's mainly for their learning and their kind of self-guided study. The required level of knowledge and reflection for the training activity is assessed just in that assessment that they've booked. Trainees quite like this because they feel like their reflections can be quite personal sometimes and they don't necessarily want everybody reading them all the time. Trainers like this because there's less to read and assess. It's just done in that half-hour slot where they assess the trainee. But trainees are still regularly reflecting and using that reflection to further their learning. Their reflection is supported elsewhere. So we run a workshop for trainees on reflective practice, and then the rotation supervisor will regularly look at maybe spot check 1 or 2 reflections a week and make sure that they're taking on any feedback from previous weeks, like maybe it might be this is more descriptive than reflective, you could improve with XYZ. So their reflective practice is supported. What does this mean in practice for assessments? It means that most assessments are verbal or presentation based, which means they're marked real time, which means they can be signed off almost instantaneously after the event. Staff find this easier to find time to mark. And it also means that the trainee leaves the rotation without any baggage, which they really like, because they can then completely switch their attention to their next rotation without having loads of write-ups still from previous rotations. So some of the feedback we've got so far from trainees, so no, this is trainers. Trainers think that it's a lot quicker. They're very impressed with the breadth of knowledge that trainees have gained on rotation. I think there were some concerns from staff that if trainees aren't writing these big technical reports that showcase all their knowledge, are they learning enough? But I think actually because trainees are spending less time writing these big formal reports and more time just being like, oh, I want to see that today. Oh, that's made me think about this. Can I go see this tomorrow? And actually following that self-guided curiosity, they learn a lot more. We found that trainees are more ready for their specialism because they know more about how the department works and who to talk to about what and where to find certain information. Trainees like it because they get instant feedback. So they've got a really clear direction for further learning, which is great in these really short rotation times. They get to see more practical things, which they like. They've got a better sense of what a clinical scientist does, which I think is really important because if you remember from the start, they might be having to pick what their future careers are based off these rotations, and having a better understanding of what they're going to be doing in practice, I think is really important. And they like these sort of like structured discussions with staff. So they kind of get an understanding of what level of knowledge is required, and they find that quite useful, especially in the first year rotations where things do just have to kind of be got through quite quickly.